Hello, my name is Edwin Rutsch, and I'm the director of the Empathy Center located here in beautiful Santa Barbara, California. The center's mission is to build the empathy movement and to raise the level of empathy in society through education and community building initiatives.
And my name is Anita Nowak. I teach at McGill University, and I'm the author of Purposeful Empathy, a book that invites readers to turn up the volume of empathy in their lives.
And at the beginning of 2024, Anita and I co-hosted the Empathy Summit, brought to you by the Empathy Center, and more than 40 authors of books about empathy participated.
They shared what their book was about, why they were motivated to write it, and what they hope readers will take away. Thank you so much for watching, and we hope you'll buy their book. So now it is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Heidi Maibom, who is a professor of philosophy at the University of Cincinnati and a distinguished professor at the University of South Basque Country. She is the author of The Space Between: How Empathy Really Works. Welcome to our summit. Over to you.
Thank you, Anita. What is my book about? I actually started out, I think, my career in empathy as a sort of empathy skeptic, which is to say, there was a lot of stuff about empathy going on in my field, and I thought it was somewhat overblown. And in my attempt to criticize it and try and understand empathy better, I became an empathy convert. So I suppose that's the best kind of advertisement you can have about really looking into empathy and what it does. One of the things that then happened, of course, was that I was very concerned about the critique that was then coming from philosophers and psychologists about empathy, in particular, empathy being biased, right? Empathy makes you more biased. You're just concerned about the people who are close to you, and so forth and so on. So my book's main argument is actually that empathy makes you less, not more, biased. So what I'm focusing on in my book is the type of empathy that is often called perspective taking, right? So take my perspective, see how you would feel if you were in my position. Now, I think when people talk about perspective taking, it can mean a whole lot of different things, right? So it can be a pretty vague concept that can cover, well, I want to say almost everything, but close to almost everything. So one of the things that I was particularly interested in my book was trying to make clear, what do we mean by taking my perspective? So the perspective that we have in mind, I think, is a first-person perspective. What is it to take a first-person perspective on anything? And to figure that out, we have to first figure out what is a first-person perspective. So a good deal of my book is actually concerned with what is a first-person perspective. One way we can think about it is if you come from visual art, if you think about paintings and paintings in perspective, right? So a painting in perspective will present the world a visual scene almost, right? So the world extends out from your viewpoint. If we try to understand that more metaphorically at the psychological level, what is a first-person perspective? Well, that is the perspective of someone who is having the experiences, who is acting in a certain way, who is the one who's doing the thinking, as opposed to someone who observes somebody else expressing emotions, talking, and so forth and so on, right? So that you might think of as being a distinction between a first and a third person perspective. So typically, when we think about ourselves, we reflect on our actions, that is a first person perspective. If we think about somebody else, we tend to regard them from a third person perspective. And the trick in perspective taking is then to revert. That is to, instead of taking a third person perspective on somebody else, to take a first person perspective. What does that actually mean? Well, I think in general, as a rule, what characterizes our relationship to, what characterizes our experience of the world is the relationship in which we stand to the world, right? Is a thing close? Is a thing far? Is it dangerous? Is it going to help me? Can I eat it? So forth and so on, right? So the most abstract characterization of a first person perspective is, it is the consciousness, if you like, that is sitting at the core of the web, in a web of relationships to the world, right? Fortunately, we can make that a little bit more precise, because I went through a lot of the psychological literature to try and figure out what hard data, as it were, as hard as psychological data gets, right? But what hard data do we have about what such a perspective consists in? And it turns out that there are some very interesting differences between the way we tend to think of our own actions, our own thoughts, our own motivations, our own personality, and the personality, the actions, and so forth and so on of other people. So some of the differences are, when you think about yourself, you tend to think more about why you're experiencing or feeling the things that you're feeling. When you think about others, you tend to focus on their action and why they're acting as they're doing. If you're thinking about yourself, you tend to explain what you do more in terms of actions. If you're thinking about other people, you also have a tendency to explain their actions in terms of their personal history. For instance, why is Jake always so angry? Because his father was violent towards him or something like that. Those are considerations we rarely make in our own case, unless we're at a psychoanalyst, lying, if you like, on the couch. It turns out that there are sort of very interesting differences in our autobiographical memory too, whether we remember ourselves as seeing ourselves in the memory. Then it turns out we have a more distanced view of ourselves. We tend to regard ourselves more as others would regard us, and we're more emotionally engaged at the same time. A lot of asymmetries can also be seen when people act towards us in ways that we regard as being wrong, right? So the victim-perpetrator asymmetries are very important in the literature too, right? So we tend to regard our own wrongdoing as being less bad than other people's wrongdoing, even if it is at the same level of severity. So there are all kinds of ways in which there are these interesting asymmetries. And so once we understand that we all have a particular perspective on the world, and it actually tends to be very similar across different people. That is, you can think about the perspective as being the format in which you present the world. And that format is subjectively translatable. That is, we all tend to see the world as being self-relevant, right? And it's that self-relevance that you can use when you try to take somebody else's perspective. So what we can learn from this exploration, I think, of a perspective is that we can learn what kinds of things are going to be changed if you take a first person perspective on another person versus a third person perspective. But also, and I think perhaps sometimes even equally important, taking a third person perspective on yourself, right? So if I do this, how would that be seen by somebody who is not me, for instance, right? So my favorite anecdote is from Jean-Paul Sartre, who talks about, imagine you're standing at a door and you're looking through the keyhole, maybe an ex-lover or something like that is in there, and you're just you see yourself in the act of exploring, figuring things out, and you hear a noise down the hallway, and all of a sudden, you take automatically the perspective of whomever you think is down the hallway and almost see yourself, and you realize you are peeping, right? You're a peeping John, as the British might say. So I talk more in the book about the importance of flexible in taking somebody else's point of view on yourself and taking their point of view on themselves, in the sense of these kinds of structural feature, right? As seeing yourself as the one who's doing something versus seeing yourself as somebody else who sees somebody else do or think or act in certain ways. So once we understand that, I think we can understand that we are already biased. What makes us less biased is actually empathy. It's actually taking other people's point of view on things. So this notion that empathy makes us more biased is a fundamental misunderstanding, I think, of the kind of understanding that empathy gives us. And when I talk about, I talk a lot about understanding. Sorry, I know that I'm practically done. I talk a lot about understanding in that book. I don't mean to exclude emotional understanding. I actually think that when you emotionally empathize with someone, that is a form of understanding in its own right. Anyway, thank you. Sorry for going a little over time.
Not at all, Heidi. Well, thank you so much. And I encourage anybody who's joining this call or listening otherwise to visit your website, because your bio is so fascinating, starting with the opening line of why you got into philosophy in the first place. So I'll leave that as a cliffhanger for others to check out. Thank you, Heidi.
Thank you.